Muted.
Hi everybody. Sorry about that. I appear to have been muted through my foolishness. So now hopefully you can hear me. So I'm going to talk today about big impact exhibiting and what that means. I'll keep the tone quite conversational. I'll keep the tone quite informative, but it's not going to be too preachy. I'm going to be talking about things that we should be enjoying. And I think that's genuinely an aspect of exhibiting that we should definitely remember. And I'll touch on that in various ways throughout the presentation. So hopefully everybody can see me and hear me. As I say, apologies, I just muted myself, I think, for a minute or so. So hopefully we're now back on track. I'll just whiz through what the agenda for today is going to be. So I'm going to talk about engagement. It's a word that is used a lot, perhaps too much in a way. I'm going to talk about what the industry, I think, thinks we should think of as engagement, but maybe from a personal opinion, how it tends to work and what it can actually mean for you, rather than anybody who's just trying to describe an exhibition stand or an environment. Layers of creativity and types of creativity, it's not always the same, and I'll whiz through some examples maybe of how creativity is seen in different ways. Design and general planning. There is a lot of science to exhibiting as well as art. And I think the science to things like flow and wayfinding and where to position things is critically important, certainly just as much as the one above, just as much as creativity. Technology and data, obviously very important. I'll whiz through some examples maybe of how that can and can't work and what the criteria for choice should be. Graphics and messaging, pivotal, always will be, and I think still probably in a way underrated in terms of its potential benefit on you. And the briefing and design process. So that all the above is all very nice, but how do we do it? Certainly for entry-level exhibitors or new to market exhibitors, with the support of companies like ourselves and obviously ESSA, FaceTime, those sort of bodies can obviously help with the sort of master planning, let's call it. But there's an actual mundane process to this that I think is often, again, misunderstood. And there's almost like a best practice for how we can go through that process from briefing through to completion. So engagement, as I say, it's a word that's used a lot, but if only one thing from this slide, remember this, I think exhibiting really should be more interesting than being at your desk. And if it's not, then you've missed out, because it should be a pleasure for the exhibitor, it should be a pleasure for the visitor, and both of those two are equally important. And be memorable. It's often said, but it genuinely is the case that the best exhibits do offer memories. And those memories don't necessarily have to relate to the quality of the stand that's been designed and built for you, or the quality of the fit out of the shelf scheme that you've gone for. It could be the great coffee you've served. Happy staff is always nice. A fun game, a piece of interactives maybe, a comfy chair. It can be all sorts of things that are actually the memorable factor that make people engage with you post-show, so that when you're going back to them with a really good return on investment oriented feedback of sales, it could be everything. If you're an auto company, it could be a test drive through to all just basic data capture post-show. Those can be the things that you can refer back to and actually use that as a memory trigger for improving it from just a show to part of a longer campaign. and consider the show as part of that campaign. If you've got a show in May, you really should be considering the whole year as the campaign with the show in the middle. Pre, during, and post show is very important. And there are 5 senses. Don't forget them. It's not all about the way something looks, or in audiovisual terms, how something sounds. There's some really interesting senses out there that products really that relate to senses such as smell and touch that we should not underestimate, because if we just use smell as an example, smell is very, very tied into memory, which obviously relates to the point I just made in terms of memories from a stand. Coffee is the obvious example there. New car leather is another great one. So if you can get those smells on your stand, obviously it can be quite a rather abstract but quite a good engagement piece. And involve and entertain people. People really do like to play games and win, especially at shows when it can be it can be a long day. So let them try. Fun content is genuinely and generally less like work. So if you can involve people in at least a piece of entertainment, it doesn't have to be a golf simulator or a driving simulator. Nothing against those products, but there are some new alternatives to that, which I think are well worth considering in terms of people's engagement levels at the show. And again, back to that memory. And be professional. Still a very scary statistic, but over 90% of communication is non-verbal. It's been fairly well defined now. So motivated, trained staff, they are the ones that sell the best. Sales training is very, very important, and there are some very, very good sales training companies and individuals out there who we work with and many of our customers and clients work with. And you can really make that 30 seconds count. It's a bit of an old adage, but you really do have a very short space of time to capture somebody's attention and their interest. And don't be afraid or don't be vain to think of the training as being something that maybe everybody's always able to learn something. I certainly am. And no sandwiches, please. It's again a bit of an art. But if you're eating, you're standing in your stand or twiddling with Flappy Bird or playing Tomb Raider on your phone, it's not going to look great from an exhibitor point of view. And again, we've all seen images of examples of that, and it can be really quite frustrating for both parties when it goes wrong. You can seriously lose the time that you've invested in that event. So here's some examples. I mean, this is a fairly old photo. It is genuinely one of my photos from a long, long time ago. But things have moved on, happily. This is not really how exhibiting tends to be, generally speaking, let's hope. You can see the aged photo from the TVs. It's quite scary in a way, but I do remember this sort of stand. It still exists, but things have moved on. This may well sell these products very, very well. Classy products, it couldn't be better. But things have moved on, and we can go for something a little bit better. Now here's another example. I'll talk later on about styling and theming. And again, I have absolutely nothing against inflatables per se, but maybe you could argue this has moved on as well. Obviously, this company didn't exactly suffer. Cordwell is a very large company now. Changed its name. It's now Phones for You. So it's the success of Cordwell wasn't diminished by this inflatable phone, but you have to look back on this and think, wow, that's quite what it is, and maybe I won't comment any further. Here's an example of a stand that it looks pretty good actually, but there are some sort of pick-out errors on it, I would suggest, that are worth pointing out. And if I bring in the arrows of shame, just there on the Trust logo or the Trust icon that's across the front of the stand in the perspex, it's been used as a carrier bag holder. I mean, it's almost like eating sandwiches on a stand. It's nearly there, but it's just not quite got that sort of last bit of planning thought. And it's a shame that that's the case. You actually start to misread the word trust on the front of the stand. It also forms a blockage to the stand. So even though the stand's probably about 6 by 3, 6 by 2.5, 5 or 6 people on it, okay, it's pretty full, but also the blockage across the front doesn't really help. And towards the back as well, probably quite a major strapline there, trust something, safe, I'm guessing, safety, but it's blocked. Any activity, maybe it would have been a consideration just to put that text, that messaging a little bit higher, because anybody on the stand really is going to block that message. So if we think about creativity, there are types of creativity. I'll whistle through these a little bit quickly. There's the beautifully styled, so sweeping curves, elegant details. I'll show some examples in a moment. And that can be everything from a very small stand through to a very large stand. Most of the things and the aspects and the elements I'll talk about today, I really do think would relate to any size of stand, any type of stand, any geography. Don't feel that just because some of these are illustrated by maybe slightly larger stands, that the points therein wouldn't relate to the smaller approach as well. There's abstract, there's out of context. So Wallace and Disney, you name it. If you bring something out of context in a Python-esque sort of way into stand design and exhibit design, it can have that wow factor. But you have to be careful, I would suggest. Doesn't want to go too far, otherwise things can look slightly gimmicky. But generally speaking, I would suggest people do get that right, because they weigh up their brand values against the influence of that sort of new abstract, sometimes quite zany concept. Examples to follow. Theming and comedy is part of the same, really, and this year maybe it could be the Olympics or the big film releases, but again, you have to be careful. In a way, it can data stand, even though it's current. It can obviously feel as if the stand would only work in the moment. So especially with sporting events, very, very popular, especially World Cup, Euros, that sort of thing. You often see completely non-sporting events pick up that theming quite heavily. And new and innovative. There's nothing wrong with just being new for the sake of it, but if you can embed it into the brand values of your brand, so a new use for old materials is great, upcycling, recycling. Those sort of factors can have a great eco bias and an eco benefit in terms of ticking those boxes for your clients and your customers and your visitors. But also they can have a real impact on potentially your investment as well by reusing those elements. And here's some examples. This is a stand from a few years ago. It was actually for the NEC, where the springy, the slinky spring was used in the centre of the stand, really to inhibit us or encourage a feeling of abstract sort of flexibility is the word, really. So large lettering, large messaging, but also something quite memorable, so quite quirky, which obviously relates back to one of those previous points. Here's another one, very interesting, fairly simple stand, not that big, 5x4 I think from memory. Really nice desk, really nicely thought out, which was kept and reused after the event, I believe. And then a sort of diminishing perspective, different type of creativity, quite a physics-based creativity. So you've got a diminishing perspective, throwing your eye back into the rear of the stand. Obviously, it looks quite empty, but when there's people on it, that works really, really well, because you also get a sort of a Escher-esque diminished perspective sort of illusion as well, which is quite nice, where people at the back of the stand look taller. Really quite interesting and potentially quite memorable. Another example here, fisheye view, obviously, which makes it look slightly distorted. This is a shell scheme, but it's been really nicely graphically considered for, well, it's evident, it's a pool platforms company, so it's pretty obvious what their product is. But the usage of the tiling on the bottom half, the usage of the simple graphics works really well. And even though this is slightly distorted as a fisheye view, it's quite realistic. It's sort of abstract but cartoony, and I think, again, for that company, tied into their brand messaging, worked really well. But a good use of graphics, I would suggest, which we'll pick up later. And then some other examples, small, large. So you've got, again, that sort of diminished perspective and sort of a little bit of comedy in the top left. Really nice image on the right-hand side, which is, you know, using a pop art feel. And again, that would work at any scale, and it could be done through construction or graphics. And then bottom left, a stand which is more joinery-based, more physical, more functional. But again, just some nice pickup on the colouring of their corporate logo through the tubes that link together the columns. So sometimes it can be those little things, those little parts of creativity that are just as important as the big elements, such as big chunky pieces of construction. And another example there. This is a sort of out of context example as well. Quite a large stand, but this stand has been fitted many times for our clients, Snap-on. Small, medium, and large stand. This one's, I think, Farnborough. But again, you can see the giant thread there. You know, quite quirky, quite funny, quite memorable. They use this as a tie for their post-show marketing. But it's a good example of something which is directly just an out of context piece of design and piece of build, which is fun, but it also, you know, has a meaning, obviously, to Snap-on. But it's it's quite an intricate piece of build, more difficult than it looks in terms of its physics, but it works really, really well as a memory piece again. And then there is Wallace and Gromit. That's an example from a good few years ago at the Glee show, actually, the NEC, which is a Marshalls. Obviously, they're an aggregates company. Most people who didn't know that wouldn't know that from the shop. That was very intentional. But on this stand, we've got lots and lots of direct theming to Disney, to Wallace and Gromit, to cartoon-esque sort of themes, lots of surface decoration, product in the floor. So quite an intense stand, but absolutely 100% designed to be memorable, to be a showstopper in terms of within their position in the market, to show how avant-garde their thinking was. They're not just a boring old aggregates company, was the message that came to us. And as I say, this is quite a while ago. They've moved on in different ways since, but this worked very, very well as that sort of showstopper piece. But that's what we're after. We're after, another abstract image. We're after being in the sea of boredom. We're after being the company that thought harder, worked harder, and got more out of it. So we want to be red tomatoes rather than in the sea of green. And in terms of design and general planning, there are some fundamentals that I mentioned earlier that really, really do come back to almost every stand design. Again, pretty much whatever its size. So access and flow. When you're thinking about the access to the stand is very, very important. And the classic example is, do you put your reception desk at the front of the stand or in the middle? Do you welcome people at the point of entry onto the edge of the stand, or do you use a central position to entice them into the center? Very, very simple point, but again, one of the fundamentals. And you've got to think about hotspots and dwell points. Well, what are they? This is a buzzword, but hotspots are really, and dwell points actually, they're places on stands where you really want people to stop and consider something, whether it be a product, whether it be a conversation, whether it be a piece of interactive media or a screen. They're the sort of the primary nodes, if you like, of the plan of the stand, where you predict that people will want to and need to and should spend time on the stand. And in a similar way, blind spots, the opposite. You've got to consider, if you've got a large stand with a central structure, you don't really want to, unless you've got a lot of staff, you don't really want too many primary products or graphics out of sight, because you could have somebody who's waiting there 5-10 minutes not being approached and he wanders off. And that's a huge loss in real terms. And then intrigue and secrecy. Nothing wrong with giving things away from up front as people approach a stand, but there's nothing nice than actually having a stand or stand areas that open up to the visitor as they walk in, and more is given almost as a reward for entering. And if you can give a feeling of intrigue and secrecy, not necessarily one in, one out, bouncer on the nightclub door sort of effect, but along those lines of, as I say, yeah, intrigue is the best word really. If somebody feels they're going to get more out of coming closer into the stand or actually onto it, fantastic. You've almost, you've almost got to stage one already. Practicality and modularity. I would definitely say that design that suits purpose, it's a build principle really, and design that's buildable safely. We do have to obviously consider, as an industry, health and safety, and it's very, very easy to get carried away looking at proposed images for your stand, whether it be small, medium or large, of designs which maybe can't be built safely. Maybe they're not going to be achievable in the time. Maybe they're going to blow the budget out of the water before you've even looked at the cost plan. And in time, obviously, things do have to be built within the window of build for any show. Some are quite short, some are quite long. It's part of the brief, and you should obviously consider that when you're writing your brief. Don't be afraid of volunteering the fact that maybe there's a half-day or a one-day deadline on a small window on a small show. That's vital information, just in case nobody wins if that's not picked up. And the design is sustainable and has a future use. I touched on it earlier. That's obviously useful from a stand point of view. Maybe that you want to look at a stand that's going to be used for several years, or it may be that you also want to give it a second life and bring it back to a technical centre or a reception room or a meeting room. Both entirely rational sort of ways of considering the stand reuse. And that detail, that last 10%, I've just put it on in one sentence really. People might spend 30, 40, maybe a minute, 40 seconds approaching, but they could spend 30 minutes on the stand. So that up-close detail is actually very much, can be considered as perhaps money best spent. Lighting, very, very important, is the easiest way to make a fairly mundane stand great, and obviously vice versa. And don't be afraid to push whoever's looking at the stand design with you on finishes, laminate, paint, fur. There's a whole range of sort of out of context ideas that people are now coming up with. Some of them are quite graphic driven in terms of new applications, but some of them are literally that. They're finishes. Not everything has to be covered in leather grain PVC or painted. There's a lot of other options to consider, and sometimes as an exhibitor you can help your designer or contractor to actually open their eyes and actually see it through yours. And actually maybe you've seen some textures when you've been to shows that you can impart them through the brief to the person who's designing your stand or looking at your stand. And here's some examples. This sort of modular thinking, quite Germanic, quite European, can lead to some really quite, and these are slightly larger stands actually now, but the principles remain. Both have overhead banners which are absolutely reusable, picking up on the reuse feel and theme. Both have sort of custom joinery, but in a modular fashion. Modularity is a build principle. It's not a creative restriction, and not all modular stands have to be made out of aluminium. Absolutely not. A lot of modular stands can be made in a custom build way for reuse, longevity and bespoke quality, but they've got that Lego principle built into them when they were designed, so you don't have to scratch your head in 2 years' time and wonder how it can be reconfigured into a different stand shape. Do the hard work early on. Another example there, fairly straightforward stand, can work well as an island site, 3 sides open, 4 sides open, 2 sides open even, just by using less or more elements and canopies. Another one there, more of a blocky European structure in the centre of a very large machine show, but again has to work hard as a graphic calling point as well as a hospitality hub. Another one there, seafood in Brussels last year. Just a nice example of how graphics and structure can be brought together in a larger stand. This is sort of an 8x8 space, so it's a larger stand, but again the principles remain. Some of these elements could absolutely be used on a smaller scale or even at smaller shows. And then some just individual elements of what I'm sort of talking about in terms of small elements of detail, from going from top left, some engineered features, going down to some sort of deconstructed, that white and red one in the center is a sort of deconstructed figure. Nice pieces of retail style unitary, nice textures on floors, crisp detailing on reception desks. There's a lot you can bring to the party really as an exhibition designer. It doesn't all have to be as mundane as perhaps things used to be. Mixing these styles together can work very, very well. Technology and data, not my particular field, obviously. We're more of a design and build activity myself, but obviously the way that we relate into technology and data layers is very important now, because these are not different fields. They have overlapped fully. So in terms of physical, plasmas, absolutely. I mean, everybody always thinks, let's have a plasma on the stand, what you're going to put on it, not quite sure. I think we've got a corporate video in Germany somewhere. That's not the greatest starting point. I would suggest consider the content at the same time as considering whether to actually have that AV content. If the content's good, fantastic. If the content's going to be weak, it's maybe not the ideal scenario. LED screens, again, lots of tech there. I could go on for hours about LED screens, but there's loads and loads of advantages now in terms of the price points coming down. They're thinner, they're lighter, they draw less power. So, even on a smaller scale, a reasonable investment, but nowhere near as significant as it would have been a few years ago. Touch screens, touch tables, iPads, tablets, there's lots and lots of new tech that's suddenly within the last few years available at realistically higher rates rather than purchase rates, obviously. So you can now hire an iPad stand in a way that you just couldn't do even 5 or 6 years ago. And Google Cardboard and those sorts of interactive, if you've not seen it, there's an image just coming up, but Google Cardboard is basically a few pounds version of virtual reality Oculus Rift. It's just a cardboard folding item that you wear on your head like a pair of sunglasses, put your phone into it, and with the right apps downloaded you can get some really, really stunning 3D immersive experiences, which again comes back to that engagement word that we started with. Non-physical side, social media, again, not specifically tied into design of stands as such, but obviously absolutely knitted into the pre and post show effort that you should be considering the stand as part of. It's really just not about using the iPhone on your sofa anymore. Social media is so much more, and it is about how to build a brand, how to drive a brand, but actually also engage with people in a non-physical way, but also in their own time, and effectively one-to-one as well as mass. So, and then that goes on to data intelligence. It's so much more than barcode scanners now. There's a lot that certainly we do and other companies do as well in terms of data intelligence, which is capturing data at the show but using it live, using it either live or very quickly, using it pre and post show. There's some excellent software out there. N200 Visit Connect is the obvious example because we use that. That's one of our sister companies as such, as part of GES. And I would urge you to look at those types of products. That's Visit Connect again is the one I mentioned. Really, really good example of how back end and front end tied together nicely can give you live information from a stand in a way that you just could not do a few years ago. The platform just wasn't really there. And show apps speak to the organisers. There's very often a lot of the major shows in the UK have got their own apps to cover it, just like in the European shows. Do the same thing, just to push the marketing and pre-show presence of those shows and their position in their market. So I guess my message is don't just go for the 77-inch 4K Ultra HD just because you can afford it maybe, although most people couldn't. It's still got to have a purpose, it's got to have a great feed into it, and it's got to be worth its weight, literally, and it's got to be worth its value. It's not necessarily the Snap 2 option. And there's Google Cardboard, top left, and then maybe think about top right. Interesting positions and orientations of screens can be well worth considering. Bottom left is just an example of just spinning a 42-inch plasma off the wall, putting it horizontally into a simple piece of joinery, or nearly horizontally, gives it that sort of visitor attraction touchscreen feel, that engagement you just would never ever get with even a touchscreen on a wall. Can't possibly be as engaging, and it gives you evoked feelings of Apple Store and retail environments, which take you out of context for being in an exhibition hall. Can be extremely powerful and quick way of changing people's perception of what you are. And then bottom right, the workhorse of the exhibition industry these days, the iPad or tablet. So again, I don't need to explain that, I don't think, but again, some good collateral to be had out of that. Graphics. Well, messages only tend to work when they're read, to state the blazingly obvious, but it's still worth remembering. You can have the best graphics in the world, but if they're not understood, if they're not read, if they're not taken away in people's memories, they're unlikely to have any worth whatsoever. So really 150 words, it's that old adage again. Some of these do still persist. 150 words really is a maximum, really, and that's body copy on a wall, not just headlines. Visual overkill is a killer. If you're walking down a high street, let's say a part of London with lots of restaurants in it, you'll soon see that overkill from a distance, and the repetition of the perspective along a road can kill any one individual signage unless it's particularly good. And the same thing applies to non-retail environments like an exhibition hall. Really, you've got to work hard, but if you go too far, you can actually obliterate people's senses with too much graphics. And the right media is key. Again, it's not just about vinyls on a wall or full color print. There's some really interesting substrates that you can consider, or your designer should be considering now. Fabrics obviously is the obvious one, and there are some other media as well that are new to market. Eye level or high level, and the next one's the same point really: hierarchy, company, brand, product. And what I mean by that is just next time you're at a show, just look at the stands that seem to work well from a hierarchy point of view, where they've got their corporate branding up quite high, let's say at 4 meters, then a layer below that of branding information, and maybe sub-brands of that company, and then on the sort of eye-level layer, maybe product information and sort of tactile product and AV and the sort of elements that make the stand tick. Some examples. This is only a relatively small shell scheme stand. It hasn't got a lot on it, but what it does, simply, it does actually very well. It's got faces in it, which is always nice. Smiling faces, even better. Relatively minimal furniture, but nicely styled, simply styled. AVs towards the back of the stand, but it's a simple, effective stand that sort of benefits from its simplicity. The messaging's up quite high, so it doesn't fall into that trap of being necessarily stuck behind the visitors' profiles as other people walk past. So again, even a relatively small piece of analytics on a pretty simple stand can throw up some fairly good pointers of what a simple stand has done right. It's easy to point at the stands, as I did earlier, that are, in my opinion, wrong. Well, this one's a very simple stand that's done it right. And then think about other elements of graphics as well. There's the physical. So you've got, I still rate this as graphics actually. It's a origami motif on a wall of one of our own stands, where texture is used, visual graphic texture. People can go up to that and sort of stroke it like a dog. It's a bit random. There's some nice effects you can get with texture on stands, and it shouldn't be that everything that's graphic is seen as being too flat. On the right-hand side, different fonts, different styles, different bold and italicized fonts can be a nice visual trigger, which sort of brings it into the territory of infographics and the sort of new media, if you like, of graphics work. Some other examples, really nice idea there on the left about wayfinding. I talked about zoning a little bit earlier in terms of hotspots and dwell points. Well, wayfinding is another way of doing that. Not so obviously important on a smaller stand, but on anything a little bit larger, it can be really, really nice to actually direct people in terms of what is around. This is not an exhibition stand on the left-hand side. This is a library interior from memory. It's really nice how little tricks like that are used just to encourage the eye and get people thinking about the journey that they're going to go on. That obviously lends itself perfectly to an exhibition stand, which is, again, a journey. And then the icon-driven one on the right-hand side is quite nice as well. Again, on a large stand, that's quite nice just to pull together aspects of the stand in one place. And here, this is quite an interesting one where graphics are used on the floor. So we've got some products set into the floor, air conditioning basically connecting these machines together graphically and abstractly. But the graphics are there on the floor to actually support that. And again, you're using that extra surface that most people would neglect. And then there's an example of a stand, which is actually over in Emo in Milan a few months ago, which brings it all together. So you've got some nice AV with some slave screens above some smaller tablet-sized screens. Then towards the left, some products with some specific software to support those products. A nice graphic backdrop but then look at how the orange joinery comes down the right-hand side and then across and rises up to form the surface. That's really nicely considered. That's a nice blend, I think, of what I would probably have to call a multimedia wall or a multifaceted wall, where it's got all those different things blended in. And again, you could scale that up and down to work it from a small shell scheme through to a monster stand. The principles absolutely apply. Another example there, just a blast of graphics there in a very colourful show. Brand licensing. So this stand had to jump out because so many others also jump out. So again, blasts of colour with some nice curvature work really well. And again, a smaller shell scheme, but again, look at the blast of colour, that just the selection of image, really, really encouraging on the eye, just draws you in. Two sides open helps, but again, if that was a mundane white and black sort of graphic scheme with some nice clear messaging on it, fantastic, but it wouldn't work anywhere near as well as the scheme that they went with using that chameleon eye. So the process that I mentioned earlier, pre-show, and this is probably, in a way, it's the most mechanical of the slides, but it is talking about a process that some elements of these this activity is often forgotten. So start early, within reason. Go to other shows is always a great idea, either within your own sector, whether it be food or beverage or software, or other shows in sort of slightly, more different sectors such as aerospace or medical. See how other sectors make it work. Pick some partners. How many? Well, can't really necessarily say there's a right or wrong to that. Most companies would go to a few people for design work, sometimes one, sometimes 27. But I would say visit them. Face-to-face is always best. Not all designers and contractors are created equal. And look at ESSA membership lists as well. ESSA obviously have been the forefront of that in terms of driving that sort of register of qualified companies, designers, creative agencies who can pull together the best of design and build. So use that ESSA list for the purpose that it's intended, to give you an excellent starting point for selection. Have a clear aim, ROI, that dreaded ROI. Everybody talks about return on investment. If you can try and work with your appointed company or companies to try and define that, if you can't on your own, but have a clear aim. Is it test drives for a motor company? Is it sales? Is it social media? There are various different ways you can measure success in terms of exhibiting. The obvious one is sales, but some people have too long a sales process to be able to do that. If your sales cycle is typically 6 to 9 months, it's very difficult to drive that data back and prove that it came from a show and define its worth for the following years. So maybe look at other more brand and social media aspects of how to be able to define the worth of an event post-show. Set a budget. I do think it's very important. There's very little point in not setting a budget these days, really, because it gives the designers of whatever that company is very little to start on, and it doesn't really help anybody if they come up with something massively over or under a sort of a protected or secret budget. So it's nice to be clear on inclusions and exclusions as well, I should say, actually. Review it halfway is always a great move, and allow the concepts to be presented. Because even though that you need to give up maybe an hour of your time to have each presentation from the company who's put it together, they may have a really, really good idea that's very difficult to communicate through visuals, through email, or through the post. Face-to-face, if you're going to be face-to-face exhibitors, it's probably wise to be face-to-face clients. And I have to say that from experience on both sides of that, actually, face-to-face usually comes out with extra benefits that you just wouldn't have known about or wouldn't have had presented to you by the salesperson or the project manager or the designer or who that's going to be. I think that's quite an important point. During the show, I'd say walk around, be a visitor. So check the approach on morning one or the day before, handover day. Check the approach to your stand from the entrance. Are the graphics too reflective? Have you got noisy neighbours? Is the furniture blocking your star products? And then photograph everything, good, bad, ugly, everything. Next show round, it will be vitally important for you to look back and say what worked well, what didn't work well, what should be changed, what could be changed. Yeah, the list goes on, but a very important, I think, aspect is recording what you do. And then after the show, review the results with your partner company, etc. Work on that ROI analysis, and then revisit the brief. Go right back to square one, or the top of this slide. What worked? Why didn't the things that didn't work? Why didn't they work? What was missing? What did we miss out of the brief? So you can then complete the circle yourself and write a better brief to get better results the next time around. Hardly ever done, but I have to say, again, a really, really, I would suggest, good point. Revisit the show, almost have a time machine, go back in time and see what you would have done differently and how maybe your analysis on the next point of other exhibitors Why did the guy next door get better social media coverage? Why did he get the best press coverage? Was there something physically he did different? Was it product related, or was it effort related? Again, I would say be honest about that and actually look around the show and really have a think about who's working, how it's working, and why they're doing it, and is there a secret to their art, or is it luck? And if it's luck, nothing wrong with trying to emulate luck. And these are useful. Word cloud, just when you're writing your brief maybe, throw these together. There's some proprietary sort of apps that can do this on online websites that can do this now. So you can create these word clouds just to, it's a good idea I think, because you can scale up and down the text of the important words and very clearly and efficiently and quickly communicate a hierarchy of what's important to you and what's not important but shouldn't be forgotten. So in this particular examples, yeah, fantastic. Creativity, practice, there's some bigger words. And I think this graphic illustration, if you can start to get into sort of design mode in terms of a little piece of graphics like this, maybe a simplified version of this would work just as well. Really helps you write the brief and consider that hierarchy of importance. But the final message really, before I wrap up, is, as I started really, enjoy exhibiting. Again, I think people forget that. But if you enjoy exhibiting, you'll tend to get good at it. And if you're good at it, you will get more out of it. And obviously that's a self-fulfilling circle. And that's where some of the best exhibiting companies and agencies, and interior designers, all of those guys, they've learnt that if it can be an enjoyable experience through good thinking, clear thinking, good briefing, then there's just more to come out of that experience post-show. So I'm looking at my questions. I've really only got a few, but most of them revolve around the aspects of the process, and I think really just to quickly just recap on that, I think if you're putting a list together, do what suits you. Obviously, it's ridiculous to say if you're an SME that's not got a lot of time to actually spend on the two parts of the process, the briefing part and then the presentation part. I think it would be ridiculous to go to 16, 17 companies. I think 2 or 3 is more than enough, and I would suggest, perhaps I went over it a little bit too quickly, but it's wise to not just use websites to select. I would suggest that ESSA list again, but also maybe encourage some visits to some potential designers and contractors just to make sure that what they're doing looks good face to face and up close as it does on a website. It's probably an obvious point, but I do think laziness can creep into all of this, and sometimes doing everything online and selection processes is not ideal. I think there's probably a better way, which is a little bit more interpersonal. And leading on from that, obviously, I guess that on the return on investment process after the event, there are some sort of ways that you can use some online metrics to actually do that. But again, it's got to be specific. Just picking up on another question, it's got to be specific to your product. And the example I will give is the auto industry, where most of the data is captured through post-show test drives and that sort of thing. That's very, very difficult to do in short term because there's quite a long period of time before you can track that back potentially. So again, the return on investment process of you defending and justifying the expense of the show and the time required to put that show together for the following year, potentially off a budget, that's very important to be able to do that effectively but honestly and actually demonstrate what the worth of the event was. And one way is more mechanical, such as the test drives. Others, like I mentioned, what I should probably pick up on is brand. Have you improved the brand? Can you sort of qualify the fact that the brand values have been better portrayed through the use of this particular event structure? And then similarly, there are other aspects, I think, in terms of social media, which I won't go too far into, but there are ways of tracking everything from Twitter feeds, Twitter followers, all the way through to LinkedIn posts of how the stand actually works. And that can be a great way on the actual day of actually getting that information about what you're doing on the stand, rather than talking about what we did, which is historically what people have done through press releases post-show and articles in trade magazines. This is now effectively a live environment, so you can brag about how well you're doing and how great the experience is on the day, not even the next day. So I think just for picking up on another question, that's probably one of the key points to bring out that I didn't bring out when I went through that particular page. So yeah, I think I'm about done. Checking my questions. No, those seem to be the main topics. So yeah, I'll probably come to a close. Hope you found that interesting and enjoyable. But also, if anybody does have any questions, they're happy to send me those. Probably best to do that through Carmen, who I will hand back to you now. So So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.